After finishing college, I had a hard time finding anything in my field. Apparently, a degree in psychology wasn't worth as much as I thought. After 6 months with no real prospects, I got a job offer from my friend's dad. He owned a construction company in a small town, a couple of hours from where I grew up. It wasn't the kind of job I had pictured for myself when I was studying, but it paid well, and I needed the experience. Plus, it seemed like a good opportunity to start building something for myself. When I accepted the job, my friend's dad offered to help me find a place to stay. He set me up in a trailer park not far from the office. It was a practical arrangement, since the office was where the crew met up every morning before heading to the job site. The rent at the trailer park was cheap, and I didn't mind that it wasn't fancy. I wasn't expecting luxury. All I needed was a bed and a roof over my head. The trailer I rented was old, but in decent shape. It had all the basics: a small kitchen, a tiny living room, and a bedroom that barely fit my bed. I settled in quickly and unpacked my few belongings. The trailer park itself wasn't anything special either. It was mostly rundown trailers lined up in rows, with a lot of overgrown grass and potholes in the dirt roads. Still, it seemed good enough, and I figured it would be fine for as long as I needed. One of my neighbors was a guy named Jared. He lived a couple of trailers down and looked to be around my age, maybe a little older. When I moved in, he came over and introduced himself. He was friendly enough, and we exchanged numbers in case either of us needed something. For the first week or two, everything went smoothly. I was busy with work, and when I came home, I just wanted to eat, watch TV for a bit, and sleep. Jared mostly kept to himself at first, and I didn't see much of him. The other neighbors were quiet too, so I felt like I had lucked out with the setup. But as time went on, I started to notice things that bothered me. Jared would have people over late at night, and they didn't seem like the kind of crowd you'd want hanging around. A lot of loud music, cars pulling in and out at odd hours, and arguments that sometimes got loud enough to wake me up. Something about the whole situation gave me a bad feeling, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I just wanted to stay out of it. The longer I lived there, the worse it got. Jared's trailer turned into a revolving door for all kinds of shady characters. I'd see them hanging around outside his place, smoking and talking. Sometimes they'd stare at me when I walked by, like I didn't belong there. The noise was another problem. Jared would blast music late at night, sometimes until 2 or 3 in the morning. Even with earplugs, I could still hear the bass thumping through the thin walls of my trailer. A few times, I knocked on his door to ask him to turn it down, and he always acted polite. But the music would start up again the next night, like I hadn't said anything. One time, I heard what sounded like glass breaking, followed by someone peeling out in a truck. I stayed inside when it happened. Whatever was going on, I didn't want to be part of it. Another night, things got even worse. I was sitting in my living room when someone knocked on my door. When I opened it, there was a man standing there with a gun. He didn't seem drunk or angry, just calm, which somehow made it even scarier. He didn't point it at me or anything, but he was holding it at his side. I live in an open carry state, but he was holding it with his finger on the trigger. It was intimidating. The guy asked if Jared was home. I told him his trailer was 2 doors down. He nodded and walked away like it was nothing. I closed the door and locked it, but the flimsy panel didn't make me feel much safer. The worst incident happened a few weeks later. I came home from work one evening and found one of my windows shattered. Inside, I discovered a bullet hole right through my TV. The screen had been hit too, leaving a spider web of cracks. I couldn't believe it. Someone had shot into my trailer. I felt sick just standing there, thinking about what could have happened if I had been home at the time. I called the police immediately, and they sent an officer out to take a report, but I could tell they weren't going to do anything about it. The officer asked if I had any enemies, and when I mentioned Jared, he just laughed. "That's not exactly news to us," he said. It was like they knew what he was up to, but they were just looking the other way. I was fed up. The job was going great, and I liked the work, but I couldn't deal with living in that trailer park anymore. The constant noise, the sketchy people, and everything else was too much. I didn't feel safe there, and I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep at night if I stayed. I called my parents that same evening and told them everything. They asked me to come home, and I decided to accept their offer. The next day, I told my friend's dad that I needed to quit. He was disappointed, but understanding. He even offered to help me find a place in another part of town, but I had already made up my mind. I packed up my things, loaded them into my car, and left the trailer park behind. The drive back to my parents' house felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I hated to leave the job, especially since I had been doing well and learning a lot, but I couldn't live like that anymore. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if I overreacted. Maybe I could have stuck it out and tried to find another place in town, but at the time, it felt like the only option. I was just glad to be out of there. Some things just aren't worth the risk. My name's Dallas, and I'm 30. This happened back in 2015 when my son was only 8 months old. The two of us had been driving through northern Oregon on Highway 97, and we were returning from a family reunion. It was 8 p.m., and we were going through a little town called Shanico, Oregon. Shanico is a nowhere town, where they have an abandoned hotel built in the early 1900s. They also have an ice cream parlor, a closed Texaco, and a post office that doubles as the general store. My son started crying, so I decided to pull over and take him out. I was just going to feed him briefly. He was breastfed, and I was a single mother, so I would have to stop in order to avoid listening to crying for the next hour until we got home. I pulled over to a parking lot in front of the ice cream parlor, which happens to be open only in the summer months. I had to walk around my vehicle in order to access where my son's car seat was. With the door open, I was talking to him and trying to calm him down. Within a couple minutes, out of nowhere, a man walked up behind me and put his hands around me. He locked his arms around my body, placing my hands behind my back, and said,
"It's quite lucky that you happened to come through just now."
In that moment, I felt a rush of adrenaline. I was able to push the man backwards by throwing my head into his. He released my arms and kicked the man in the family jewels. I slammed my son's door shut, ran around the car, and barely got to the driver's seat in time. Just then, the man got up from the ground, where I pushed him. He recovered and had made it to the back of my vehicle. Within a minute, I had my car in reverse, and I backed into the man. I floored it about 3 miles down the highway with my son screaming in the back seat. Thank God he was still buckled in. I stopped to get out and check that he was okay, before continuing on. I had no cell phone reception in the Shanico area, and I was unable to get reception until I was almost to a trucking town called Biggs. That's where Highway 97 and Interstate 82 meet. Once I reached Biggs, I called the police and reported the incident to the Wasco County Sheriff's Department. The police officer I spoke to on the phone said he went out to Shanico and was unable to find the man. I never heard anything else about the incident. It still haunts me to this day, and I'm thankful every day that my son was buckled into his car seat. This took place over 10 years ago when I was still in school. I was in the 11th grade, I think. My parents and I lived on the outskirts of a small town in Pennsylvania. We had a 3-bedroom house with a big yard that stretched over an acre. I didn't mind being in a quiet area, but being a teenager, I often wished I lived somewhere with more to do. When this happened, I was 17, and my parents had gone on a week-long vacation to Pensacola, Florida. They left on a Saturday morning, and since I was their only child, that meant I had the house to myself for a full 7 days. At first I thought it would be fun. I'd have the freedom to do whatever I wanted. I could stay up late and eat whatever I want. That summer, I was working at a pizza shop in town to save up for college. The work wasn't great, but I liked my coworkers and the tips were decent. Most of my shifts were evenings, which meant I didn't usually get home until after 10 p.m. When I got back to our house, I'd make myself a quick snack, then either watch TV or play video games until late at night. The first few days of being alone were uneventful. I'd check in with my parents once a day, so they wouldn't worry. Then I spent the rest of my time either at work or relaxing at home. Our property was pretty isolated, with no neighbors close by, so I wasn't too concerned about noise or anything like that. It was a Wednesday night when things started to feel off. I'd just gotten home from work at around 10:15. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway, and I remember pausing for a second to look out at the yard. Everything looked normal. I went inside, locked the door behind me, and made myself a grilled cheese sandwich before heading to my room. I started up my console and was half an hour into a game when I heard the first noise. It sounded like a knock, faint but clear. I paused the game and listened for a second, but when I didn't hear anything else, I shrugged it off. I figured it was probably just the wind or an animal outside. About 20 minutes later, I heard it again. It was 3 quick knocks, I froze for a moment and stared at the door. It didn't sound like it was coming from outside, but I couldn't be sure. I got up and went downstairs, then turned on the porch light and checked the front door. No one was there. I stood there for a minute, looking out at the dark yard. It was completely empty as far as I could see, but after a few feet, it was too dark to see much. After a while, I went back inside, locked the door again, and returned to my room. I was telling myself it was nothing. The sound came again, though. I heard it about 10 minutes later, and this time, it was louder and faster. It sounded like knocking, but it wasn't coming from the front door. My stomach started to twist as I sat on the edge of my bed, listening. I turned off the TV so I could hear better and tried to pinpoint where the noise was coming from. At first, it seemed like it was coming from one side of the house, but as I walked down the hallway, I realized it sounded like it was moving. That's when it hit me. It was coming from inside the house. I checked the windows and doors first, making sure everything was locked. They were. I walked through the kitchen, then the living room, trying to figure out what was making the noise. Every time I thought I had it figured out, it seemed to shift. When I reached the door to the basement, I hesitated. The sound was coming from down there now, loud and clear. I stood frozen for a second, staring at the door. I was trying to convince myself that I was just imagining things. But then I heard it again, 3 knocks followed by a faint scraping sound. The basement in our house was unfinished. It was cold, dreary, and it really creeped me out. I never liked going down there, especially at night, but I knew I couldn't just ignore it. I opened the door and flipped on the light switch at the top of the stairs. The bare bulb flickered to life, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. I stood at the top of the stairs, listening. The knocking had stopped. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" But the only response was silence. I thought about going down, but my gut told me not to. I closed the door again and backed away, feeling more unsettled by the second. I went back to my room and closed that door too. I sat on my bed, gripping my phone, trying to figure out what to do. The sound started up again, but this time, it was followed by what sounded like footsteps. That's when I knew I wasn't imagining things. Someone was in the house. I grabbed my phone and called the police. My voice was shaking as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. She told me to stay calm and keep the line open. I stayed in my room and turned off the lights. The noises kept coming. There were knocks, footsteps, and what sounded like faint scraping. I sat there in the dark, clutching my phone, trying to keep quiet. It felt like an eternity before I saw the police cars outside. I heard them knocking on the front door, shouting, "Police, is anyone inside?" I called out that I was upstairs, and they told me to stay where I was. The officers searched the house and eventually found the intruder in the basement. He was hiding down there, and they arrested him on the spot. I stayed upstairs, too afraid to go down until they assured me it was safe. Later, they told me he had a long criminal record and had been involved in several violent crimes. He'd stolen a truck and abandoned it near our property before breaking into our house. The scariest part is that when they searched the house, they found a gun in the basement, not far from where he was hiding. It didn't belong to anyone in my house, so they knew it was his. The cops believed he had been waiting for the right moment to attack me. I called my parents the next morning to tell them what happened. They cut their vacation short and came home that day. For weeks after that, I couldn't sleep without checking every lock in the house, multiple times. Even now, I get uneasy whenever I hear a strange noise at night. When I was 19, I spent a summer taking care of my grandparents' house while they traveled to visit family overseas. They lived in a small ranch-style home in rural Michigan. It wasn't totally isolated. There were a few houses along the road, but their nearest neighbor was about a quarter-mile away. They asked me to stay there because their property needed constant upkeep. There was a vegetable garden, a couple of chickens, and an old dog named Max who needed to be fed twice a day. It was quiet, and I figured it would be a nice change from the noisy apartment I shared with my roommates back in college. The first couple of weeks were uneventful. I'd get up early, take care of Max and the chickens, then spend the rest of the day reading or watching movies. I'd occasionally drive into town to grab groceries, but most of my time was spent on the property. The peace and quiet felt nice at first, but after a while, I started to feel restless. One evening, I was sitting on the back porch, watching the sun dip behind the trees. The woods stretched out behind the house like an endless wall of green, and as the light faded, I noticed something strange. In the distance, past the garden, there was a faint flicker of light. It looked like a flashlight or maybe a campfire. I wasn't sure what to make of it. My grandparents didn't have any neighbors directly behind them. It was just woods. I figured it could have been hikers or kids camping, but it still felt out of place. I kept watching for a while, but the light eventually disappeared, and I went back inside. The next morning, I walked out to the garden to check on the vegetables, but something wasn't right. A couple of tomato plants had been trampled, and one of the wooden stakes used for the beans was snapped in half. At first, I thought it might have been an animal, maybe a deer, but the more I looked, the more it didn't make sense. The footprints around the plants were too big and clear to belong to any animal. It unnerved me, but I didn't want to overreact. I figured someone might have wandered onto the property by mistake, so I decided to let it go. I spent the rest of the day trying to keep myself busy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. That night, I kept the porch light on and made sure the doors were locked. At around midnight, Max started growling. He was an old dog and didn't move much these days, so when he suddenly got up and stood by the back door, it caught my attention. I turned off the TV and listened. At first I didn't hear anything, but then there was a faint noise. It sounded like branches snapping and leaves crunching. It was like someone walking through the woods. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the window, shining it out into the backyard. The beam of light cut through the dark, but I didn't see anyone. I stood there for a few minutes watching. Then I turned off the flashlight and headed back to the couch. Not long after, I heard it again, and this time, it sounded even closer. After turning on the back patio lights, I flicked on the flashlight and waved it around. At first I didn't see anything, but then out of nowhere, I was grabbed from behind. I was sure it was a man, because I could feel the rough stubble of his beard on my cheek. He had a tight grip on me, but somehow, I broke free and struggled back into the house. I managed to get the door closed and locked, but I could still see the man from the window. He was pacing back and forth on the patio, but never looked in at me. He looked like a normal guy. He wasn't dirty or crazy looking. I locked myself in the bedroom and called the sheriff's department. The dispatcher told me they'd send someone out, but it might take a while since it was a bit of a drive for them. I sat in the bedroom with Max, and I tensed up every time I heard another noise outside. At one point, I thought I heard the porch steps creak, but I still don't know if it was my imagination. Part of me was hoping the man was gone, but I was also hoping that he'd be caught. About 30 minutes later, I saw the flash of headlights through the window. The sheriff's deputy knocked on the door. He asked me what had happened, and I told him everything. He went outside to look around while I stayed inside with Max. After about 10 minutes, he came back, holding something in his hand. It was a small, weathered notebook that he'd found near the edge of the woods. It was filled with strange, scribbled notes. There were dates, times, and descriptions of people and places. It looked like the man had been keeping track of the property, and maybe even watching me. The deputy stayed for another hour, walking the perimeter of the property and checking the woods, but he didn't find the guy. Before he left, he told me to call if anything else happened. I barely slept that night, and the next morning, I packed up my things and drove back to my parents' house. I called my grandparents to let them know what had happened, and they understood. They installed cameras and motion lights around the property after that, but they never figured out who had been out there or why. To this day, I wonder how long that person had been watching and what they were planning to do. A few years ago, I moved to a small town for a new job. It was over 5 hours away, so I rented a house without seeing it in person. From the photos, it looked rough around the edges. There was peeling paint on the outside, some overgrown bushes, and a yard that hadn't been touched in a long time, maybe years. But it was spacious, private, and surrounded by beautiful scenery. It wasn't perfect, but I figured I could make it work. I didn't have a family or a partner to worry about, so moving alone didn't feel like a big deal. I arrived on a Friday afternoon. When I took a closer look at it, the house was worse than I expected. The floors were scuffed, the walls were yellowed, and the windows were grimy. There was a faint, musty smell throughout the house, the kind you'd expect from a place that had been sitting empty for a long time. Still, I liked the location. The property was surrounded by trees, and the nearest neighbor was a good distance away. I thought I'd enjoy the privacy. After unloading my car, I spent the rest of the day unpacking. It took longer than I thought, and by the time I was done, it was getting dark. I ordered a pizza, ate in the living room, and called it an early night. That's when I started noticing some strange noises. The house creaked a lot. At first I thought it might just be the wind or the old wood, but the sounds were loud enough to make me pause. At one point, I heard what sounded like scratching coming from the walls. I was pretty sure it was mice or rats that had infested the house. I didn't like the thought of rodents, but it didn't seem like a huge deal. I figured I'd call an exterminator in the morning. The house felt strange that first night, but I told myself I was overthinking it. Moving somewhere new always feels a little off at first. I got into bed and forced myself to relax. Eventually I fell asleep, but I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. For a few seconds, I couldn't figure out what had woken me, but then I heard it. There were clear footsteps in the house. They weren't loud, but they were unmistakable, and they were coming from just outside my room. The footsteps moved slowly, like someone was trying not to make a sound. It was like they were tiptoeing. I squinted into the dark, trying to see what was there. Then I turned to look out into the hallway through my partly open bedroom door. For a moment, I thought I saw the outline of someone standing there looking into my room, but it was hard to tell if my eyes were playing tricks on me. Then, before I could do anything, the door to my bedroom creaked all the way open. A man stood there, barely visible in the dim light coming from the hallway. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a second or two. Then he bolted. He didn't say a word. He just turned and ran down the hallway, his footsteps echoing against the hardwood floor. Then I heard the front door slam open, and by the time I got out of bed and reached the hallway, he was gone. I ran to the front door and looked outside. The man was running down the road, illuminated by the streetlights. All I could tell about him was that he was tall and thin, with long hair and a beard. I watched him until he disappeared into the distance. I stood there for a while, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't decide if I should call the police or try to convince myself it was all a bad dream. But I knew it was real. There was no denying that. Finally, I locked the door, sat on the couch, and called the police. They arrived about an hour later. By then, I had gone over everything in my head a dozen times, but it still didn't feel real. I told them what had happened and described the man as best I could. They searched the house and checked the locks on all the windows, but everything seemed secure. Nothing was stolen, and there were no obvious signs of forced entry. One of the officers said the man might have been living in the house before I moved in. He said that places like this get squatted in all the time. He probably thought it was abandoned and panicked when he realized someone was here. It made sense, but it didn't make me feel any better. The idea that someone had been in the house, maybe for days or weeks before I got there, was unsettling. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I couldn't stay in that house, not after what happened. I called my landlord, explained the situation, and asked to break the lease. To their credit, they didn't argue. I packed up my things that same day and found a short-term rental in town while I looked for another place. It wasn't the fresh start I'd imagined, but I was grateful nothing worse had happened. I still think about that night sometimes, wondering how long he had been there and what might have happened if I hadn't woken up. One thing's for sure, I'll never rent a house sight unseen again.